All right, so you're ready for a deep dive, huh? We're going to be exploring some fascinating Islamic perspectives today, really getting into it.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
We're talking about big stuff today, the environment, economics, even we'll get into the cosmos a little bit.
Wow.
Yeah, you've given us quite the mix of sources to dig into, so
Sounds like a challenge.
yeah, yeah. Well, one of these papers, it sounds a pretty serious eco-alarm, especially I think for Muslim majority countries maybe to consider.
Okay.
Then we've got another source that looks at this Hizmet movement, which I always find really interesting because it blends Islamic values with social entrepreneurship.
Right.
And then just to keep things really interesting, we've got one that explores Muslim cosmology, specifically the Sufi tradition, which I have to say might blow your mind a little bit.
I'm intrigued already.
Yeah, yeah. And then to round things out, we've got a source that really challenges like conventional economics with a distinctly Islamic approach,
Right.
and then one on Muslim political thought too. So by the end of this depth dive, I think you'll have a pretty solid grasp of these complex topics and some serious food for thought.
I'm looking forward to it.
Let's start with that eco-alarm I mentioned. Al-Khatiri, he's the author of this paper we're looking at, and he really doesn't pull any punches. He uses this phrase, Janus-faced colonial mentality,
Oh, wow.
which is quite an attention grabber, I thought.
It is.
What did you think of that?
Well, it's a powerful image for sure, and it gets to the heart of what he's critiquing. He's essentially saying that some post-colonial societies, even after they've shaken off colonial rule, they end up adopting these economic models that are harmful to their own environments, the same models that were kind of imposed on them by their colonizers.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, he's not just talking about Muslim-majority countries. This whole thing about a colonial mentality, it can be seen all over the world.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It makes you wonder, are we truly independent if we're just mimicking practices that are unsustainable?
Exactly.
Like, where's the real freedom in that?
Yeah. And Al-Khatiri, he argues that this mimicry often leads to too much focus on unfettered individualism and just kind of letting market forces run wild, which he sees as key drivers of the environmental crisis we're in.
Right.
He even says, and I'm quoting here, too much freedom has been given to the market forces.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
But it leads to his main point, which is this whole idea of limits to growth.
Yeah.
He reminds us that we can't just have endless economic expansion. We live on a finite planet.
Right.
He actually uses this thing called footprint analysis, which calculates how much land and resources are needed to support our current lifestyles. And it's pretty shocking.
It is. I remember he mentioned that if everyone on Earth lived like, say, Americans or Europeans, we'd need something like 5 to 10 planets worth of resources.
It's mind-boggling, right?
Totally.
And it's not even just about those raw materials. He also talks about the Earth's services,
Right.
things that we take for granted.
Like what?
Like regulating the climate, purifying water, all that stuff, cycling nutrients. These are all services the planet provides. And a lot of those services are getting disrupted by what we're doing, which makes it even more urgent.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So if this path we're on, endless growth, if that's a dead end, then what's the alternative? What does Al-Khatiri offer?
Well, he points to the Islamic principle of tawhid as a guiding principle, he thinks, for a more sustainable way of life.
Tawhid. Okay, so for folks who might not know, that's the oneness of God, right? How does that connect to the environment?
Well, tawhid emphasizes the interconnectedness of all creation.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful framework for environmental action because it shifts our perspective.
How so?
Well, instead of just seeing ourselves as the masters of the earth, we become more like stewards. We're part of this intricate web of life.
That's a good point.
Yeah, changes how you see things.
I remember he even uses this, it's a visual representation called the sigmoid curve to suggest that our current civilization, well, we might be at a peak, and a decline could be right around the corner unless we make some changes.
Yeah, it is a sobering thought.
Yeah, definitely.
But he's not trying to be all doom and gloom. Al-Khatiri, he believes that by embracing the principles of tawhid and remembering that we're all connected, we can create a more sustainable and harmonious future.
Okay, so that's a pretty stark warning about the state of the environment. But let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about a potential source of hope, the Hizmet movement. This is a movement inspired by Fethullah Gulen. And it seems to offer a different approach, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. The Hizmet movement, which by the way means service, it focuses on putting Islamic values into action through things like education, healthcare, and interfaith dialogue.
Right.
Gulen, who's an Islamic scholar and social activist. He emphasizes service to humanity as like a core principle.
It's really impressive, I think, the scale of this movement. Paul, who wrote the paper we're looking at about the Hizmet movement, he mentions that it's got a global presence with all kinds of different organizations involved in these initiatives.
Yeah, it's not just talk. They're really out there making a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're doing it, as you said, without trying to impose, a theocracy.
Right, they're not about that.
They want to harmonize Islamic values with modern life, including, participating in a market economy. It's kind of a both-and approach.
Yeah, faith and progress can go together. I think that's what they're showing.
Yeah, I agree. And Paul really emphasizes education as like the foundation of the movement. Gulen actually calls it a sublime duty. And it's interesting how these Hizmet-inspired schools often excel in like science and math, but they also teach essential business skills too.
It's that concept of social entrepreneurship, right? Like they're blending profit making with the social mission.
Right. They're not afraid of business, but they're doing it ethically.
Exactly. You can be successful and contribute to the well-being of your community and still adhere to your Islamic values. They're proving that's possible.
Which actually brings us back to Al-Khatiri's critique, doesn't it? Both sources are pushing back against the idea that economic growth is the only thing that matters.
That's a good point.
Hizmet is offering this alternative where ethical values guide economic activity.
Absolutely. They're both pushing for a paradigm shift, moving away from a purely materialistic worldview toward a more holistic ethical approach.
Okay, speaking of shifting perspectives, get ready to explore something pretty fascinating, the world of Muslim cosmology. We're going to dive into the Sufi tradition, which has some pretty mind-blowing insights about the seen and unseen.
Sounds like a trip. I'm ready.
It definitely is. But before we get to mystical, let's clarify what we mean by cosmology. We're not just talking about, stars and planets and stuff.
Right.
We're talking about how we understand our relationship with the universe, with the seen and the unseen, the material and the spiritual. It's a big picture kind of thing.
It is. It is.
And Eliswad, the author we're looking at here, he points out that the Arabic word for cosmos kon implies something that's dynamic, more like a process than a static picture.
That's interesting.
I thought so too. And this dynamic understanding is key to understanding Muslim cosmology, especially within the Sufi tradition.
Okay, so for someone who maybe isn't familiar with the Sufism, how would you describe it, and how does it connect to this cosmology idea?
Well, Sufism is often called the mystical branch of Islam.
Mm.
Sufis, they seek a direct experience of the divine, They go beyond the rituals and try to cultivate a deeper connection with God through spiritual practices like meditation, chanting, contemplation, things like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
And what I love about how El-Aswad describes this is he talks about how in Sufi thought, the entire cosmos is engaged in this continuous act of glorifying God Tasbih, even if we can't perceive it with our senses.
Right, it's happening all around us, even if we don't see it.
Exactly. And he even quotes the Quran where it says, "The seven heavens and the earth and all beings therein glorify him, and there is not a thing but glorifies his praise, but you do not understand their glorification." It's pretty amazing, right? Like everything is part of this grand act of praise.
It is. It's a beautiful thought.
So it makes you wonder, if everything is glorifying God, are we part of that? Are we in tune with that? Or are we kind of missing out?
Yeah, that's a big question for sure.
It is, and it leads to another key concept in Sufi cosmology, which is Haib the unseen.
Oh yeah, Haib. That's where things get really mystical, right?
They do. So what is Haib exactly, and how do Sufis understand it?
Well, Haib basically encompasses everything that's beyond our ordinary perception, like the realm of angels, spirits, all the divine mysteries. Sufis, they believe there are two types of knowledge. One, based on observing the physical world, and the other based on this kind of mystical insight into the unseen. And through spiritual practices, purifying the heart, you can access that hidden knowledge. You can experience the realm of Haib.
So it's like there's this whole other dimension vibrating with divine energy that we could potentially tap into.
It's a pretty amazing idea.
It really is. It makes you wonder what would be possible if we could experience that level of interconnectedness, if we could shift our focus beyond just the material world.
It definitely challenges us to think about reality in a different way.
It does. Okay, before we get completely lost in the cosmic currents here, let's bring it back down to earth for a bit and revisit economics. Zaman's paper, the one on Islamic economics, this one really shakes things up. He doesn't just tweak the existing system, he calls for a complete overhaul of conventional economics based on Islamic principles.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back.
He doesn't. He criticizes the foundations of modern economics, saying its reliance on axioms and deductive reasoning is just too limited.
Right. He argues we need a completely new way of thinking about economics that's actually in line with the Quran and Hadith, something that reflects Islamic values.
So how does he define Islamic economics?
It's about implementing divine commands, really, regarding economic affairs, not just in our personal lives, but also at the level of the global Muslim community, the Ummah.
It's a much bigger vision.
It's a comprehensive approach, everything from earning and spending to consumption choices, social responsibility. It's all connected.
It's not just about following a set of rules, it's about aligning your actions with a higher purpose.
Exactly. And that purpose in Islam is to worship Allah. Zaman says all aspects of our lives should be directed towards that goal.
That's a pretty big difference from the way we usually think about economics, where profit and individual gain are the top priorities. What are some of the key features that make this Islamic approach unique?
One of the big ones is the focus on the Ummah, the whole Muslim community, as the main unit of analysis. So Islamic economics considers the well-being of the entire community, not just individuals or nations.
That contrasts with the Western idea of the individual as the primary actor.
Right, and it pushes us to think beyond our own self-interest and consider the impact of our actions on a much wider scale.
It's a more holistic view.
Absolutely. Another key difference is that in Islamic economics, your intentions matter. It's not just about the outcomes, it's about the motivations behind your actions.
He makes this point with a really interesting example where he says that even if a selfish action leads to some kind of social benefit, it's still not acceptable in Islamic thought. It goes against that whole invisible hand theory in Western economics.
It's a really different way of thinking about things. In Islamic economics, ethical behavior comes first, always. It's about aligning your actions with divine principles, even if it means sacrificing some material benefit.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, but let's switch gears one last time for this part of our deep dive. Let's look at this source on Muslim political thought. This one seems to deal with this tension between divine authority and human agency when it comes to choosing leaders. It's complicated stuff.
It is. The question of who has the right to rule and how leaders should be chosen, well, it's been debated for centuries in Islamic thought.
Right, and it's a debate that goes beyond Islam. Throughout history, people have wrestled with where political authority really comes from, whether it's God, the people, or maybe some combination of both.
It's a fundamental question about how societies function.
Exactly. And as we've seen, this source shows that there isn't just one view within Islam. Al-Farabi's idea of a virtuous ruler is interesting. But most Sunni scholars don't support a theocracy. They emphasize what they call civil authority, meaning political power comes from the consent of the governed, not a direct mandate from God.
That makes sense, considering how much Islam emphasizes consultation and reaching consensus.
It does. That focus on consent is key. It suggests that public participation in the political process was considered important even in traditional Islamic thought.
And that idea is also reflected in this concept of al-hol wa aqla, this group that represents the community and plays a role in choosing the leader. It challenges the assumption that Islamic political thought is inherently authoritarian.
Absolutely. There's this strong tradition of consultation and consensus building that we could probably learn a lot from, especially with all the political challenges we face today.
I think so. And it's important to remember that this concept of al-hol, or al-aqd, has continued to evolve. In modern Islamic political thought, there's a big focus on things like democratic principles and institutions as ways to ensure public participation and hold governments accountable.
It's not just this static, fixed concept. It's something that can be adapted to different contexts.
Exactly. And that adaptability is one of the strengths of Islamic political thought. It gives you a framework to deal with the challenges of governing while also upholding these core values of justice, fairness, and consultation.
But as we've seen, there are definitely a variety of interpretations and approaches within that framework. Like this source also brought up the Shia idea of imama.
Right, where the leader is divinely appointed and it passes down through the Prophet Muhammad's lineage.
Yeah, and that difference in how they view leadership is a big distinction between Sunni and Shia Islam. It shapes how they view political authority and how they believe it should be used.
It's a fundamental difference.
So it's important to remember that there isn't one monolithic way of approaching politics within Islam. It's more like a tapestry, with lots of different ideas and interpretations, all with their own strengths and weaknesses.
It's a good reminder that we need to approach these topics with nuance and be aware of that diversity.
And speaking of nuance, we have to mention Ibn Khaldun. His perspective on understanding political power is so fascinating.
He was way ahead of his time, focusing on these social dynamics and how power operates in cycles.
His idea of asabiya, social solidarity, is so interesting. It basically highlights that group cohesion is a huge source of political power, and it explains how dynasties rise and fall depending on whether that cohesion strengthens or weakens.
It's a way of looking at history that can help us understand how power dynamics work today.
Absolutely. We can see how social movements gain power as they build solidarity and how regimes can collapse when they lose that base of support. It's all connected.
It shows that political power is never static. It's constantly changing, always being shaped by those social forces.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we need to understand those forces if we want to work towards a more just and equitable society.
Where power is shared fairly and used for the benefit of everyone.
Right. Which brings us to these modern Muslim reformers, Afghani and Abdu.
Yeah.
They saw all the challenges of colonialism and modernity and really pushed for a renewal of Islamic thought and action.
They were pioneers. They advocated for educational reform, engaging with modern science and technology, and they called for a more dynamic approach to Islamic law.
It's impressive. They believed that Islam had the potential to offer real solutions to the problems of the modern world, but it needed to adapt.
To keep up with the times.
Exactly. And their emphasis on reason, critical thinking, and social justice is still inspiring people today.
It speaks to the enduring relevance of Islamic thought.
Yeah.
It's not stuck in the past. It has the capacity to adapt to new realities while staying true to those core values.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. It's amazing how these different topics connect and give us this bigger picture view of how Islamic thought is engaging with the world today.
It's been a whirlwind tour, but I think it's clear there's so much more to explore.
Absolutely.
Welcome back. As we keep digging into these sources, one thing that really stands out to me is how much emphasis they all place on knowledge, on learning.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like this common thread running through everything from, understanding how all creation is connected to like building a just economic system.
Yeah. It makes me think of that hadith, the one that says, seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim.
Oh, yeah.
These sources are really taking that to heart, applying it to all these big issues we're facing today.
Absolutely. And it's not just like passively absorbing information.
Yeah.
It's about thinking critically, challenging assumptions, actually engaging in a dialogue. It's about shaping a better future.
Al-Khatiri's warning, the one about our consumption habits being unsustainable, that was pretty intense.
Yeah.
If we don't change course, the future he's describing is, well, pretty bleak.
Yeah.
Makes you want to just, disappear off the grid.
I get it. It's a sobering analysis. But remember, he does offer a path forward.
Right.
A way to live more sustainably and justly.
Right. Tawhid. That's the key, right?
Yeah.
Understanding that everything is interconnected, we can move away from just exploiting the earth and develop a more harmonious relationship with nature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tawhid, it really lays out the ethical framework for environmental stewardship from an Islamic perspective.
Right.
It reminds us, that we're not the masters of the earth.
Right.
We're caretakers. It's like a sacred trust.
Yeah, it's a gift from God. We're obligated to protect it.
Exactly.
This idea of the earth as a sacred trust, that resonates with people from different faith traditions too,
It does.
It's a reminder that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Our actions have consequences.
That's a crucial point.
Mhm.
I think we often get so caught up in this whole consumerism thing, always wanting more, instant gratification. And we forget about the long-term impact of what we're doing.
Right.
Al-Khatiri's paper is a good reminder to think about the consequences of our choices, not just for ourselves, but for, all life on Earth.
It's interesting, this idea, interconnectedness, it also pops up in El Aswad's paper, the one about Muslim cosmology. Remember that concept of the whole cosmos glorifying God?
PSB. And that glorification, it's not just happening in the physical world either.
Right.
It extends to Hybe, the unseen, all the angels, spirits, all the mysteries of the divine.
Right, right.
Sufis believe that if you purify your heart and align yourself with the divine, you can actually join this cosmic symphony. Experience this deeper connection to the source of all creation.
It's mind-blowing to think about, this whole unseen dimension full of this divine energy, and that we might be able to tap into it.
It makes you wonder.
It does. Makes you wonder, what would be possible if we could shift our focus beyond the material and experience that level of connection?
It's an incredible thought, for sure. It's like Maybe the boundaries between what we can see and what's unseen are more fluid than we realize.
It makes me think of stories about Sufi saints, performing miracles,
Yeah.
things that seem impossible. Maybe they're tapping into a level of awareness, a connection to the unseen that lets them interact with reality in a way that we just don't understand.
It's a question people have been asking for centuries.
Right,
We may not have all the answers,
right.
but Sufi cosmology, it definitely offers a different way to think about reality. It encourages us to consider that there might be this, like, hidden order underlying everything, even the things we can see and touch.
Okay. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with all this talk about unseen realms and cosmic symphonies.
I hear you.
Let's get back down to earth for a bit and revisit the Hizmet movement. Paul's paper, it highlighted their work, putting Islamic values into action, especially through education.
Right.
I'm curious about how those Hizmet-inspired schools actually work, like what makes them different.
That's a good question. Paul points out that they often stand out for their focus on academics. They really want to prepare students for success in the global marketplace.
Especially in science and math, right?
Yeah, you see that a lot. But it's not just about memorizing facts and doing well on tests. There's also this emphasis on character development and ethical leadership.
Yeah, I was getting that sense too. So it's not just about like getting ahead, it's about being a good person too.
Exactly. Gulen talks a lot about raising well-rounded individuals, people who are not only smart, but also morally upright and committed to serving others.
So they're trying to cultivate future leaders who can navigate the complexities of the modern world while staying true to their ethical principles.
That's a great way to put it. They believe that education is about more than just acquiring knowledge and skills.
Right.
It's about cultivating a sense of purpose, a commitment to making a positive difference in the world.
Which connects back to what Zaman was saying about Islamic economics, right?
Yeah.
That true fulfillment comes from aligning our actions with a higher purpose.
It's a good connection. Both sources are basically urging us to rethink our priorities, to shift away from just chasing material wealth and towards a more holistic view of success, one that includes our spiritual and ethical dimensions.
So there's this consistent theme, right? This desire to create a world that's more just, equitable, and sustainable.
It's not just about critiquing the problems, it's about actively working towards solutions.
Yeah. But it's not always easy, right? I mean, Paul mentioned the challenges that the Hizmet movement has faced, especially in Turkey. Their success seems to have made them a target.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. The focus on education and dialogue, even their global reach, has been perceived as threatening by some.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always smooth sailing. Challenging the status quo often comes with a price.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering thought, especially when you think about Al-Khatiri's warnings about the potential for social and political upheaval as the consequences of our actions catch up with us.
You're right. We're living in uncertain times. Al-Khatiri's paper, with its focus on limits to growth and the possibility of, even civilizational collapse,
Yeah.
it forces us to confront these challenges.
Yeah.
But it's also a call to action,
Yeah.
a push to find ways to adapt and innovate, to build a future that's more resilient, more just.
And it seems like the Hizmet movement could offer a model for that kind of future.
I think so.
Their focus on education, social entrepreneurship, dialogue, these could be powerful tools for bridging divides and addressing those root causes of conflict and inequality.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that they're not just successful in Turkey.
Right.
They've built schools and hospitals and other social initiatives all over the world,
Wow.
over 100 countries. Yeah. It shows you the power of their message, and how effective their approach is.
It's amazing to see them putting their faith into action like that, making a tangible difference in people's lives and actually working towards a better future, not just talking about it.
It's a testament to, that human capacity for compassion, innovation, resilience, even when we're facing really tough challenges.
Right. It gives you hope.
Yeah.
Reminds you that change is possible,
It does.
even with all the difficulties we're up against. Speaking of change, I want to go back to Zaman's idea of a third generation of Islamic economics for a minute. He's not talking about making little tweaks to the system. He's calling for a complete transformation, a whole new way of thinking about economics and what it should achieve.
He's definitely going for something radical.
Yeah.
He says we need to go beyond both conventional Western economics and those earlier attempts to kind of just like sprinkle Islamic principles on top of existing models.
Right.
He wants to start fresh, create a framework that's rooted in the Quran and Hadith.
Okay, so what does this third generation look like? What are the key differences?
One of the biggest is this concept of halal. What's permissible or lawful.
Right.
Islamic economics says everything has to be done according to Islamic law, which has a strong ethical dimension.
So it's not just about maximizing profit.
No,
It's about making sure those profits are earned ethically.
exactly. Islamic law, it prohibits practices like usury and gambling and speculation, things that are completely normal in conventional economics.
Right.
And it emphasizes things like fairness, transparency, and social responsibility in all transactions.
That sounds like a big shift from how a lot of businesses operate today. Can a system like that really compete in the global marketplace?
That's the question, right? A lot of people are trying to figure that out. But Zaman and other advocates, they believe it's possible to build an economic system that's both ethical and profitable.
Hmm.
And they point to examples of successful Islamic financial institutions that are already doing it. They're proving it can work.
So there are real world models out there. That's encouraging. It means this third generation isn't just some idealistic theory. It actually has the potential to be a path to a better future.
I agree. Though it's important to say that Islamic economics as a field, it's still developing.
Sure.
There's a lot of discussion research going on about the best way to implement these principles in today's economy.
It's exciting, though, isn't it? Imagine an economy that's actually driven by justice and fairness, where everyone's well-being is a priority.
Yeah, it's a vision worth pursuing. These sources give us a lot to think about, a lot of inspiration.
Okay, we've been talking about working towards a better world, so let's go back to that source on Muslim political thought for a minute.
Okay.
We were talking about that balance between divine authority and human choice when it comes to leadership,
Yeah.
and all the different perspectives within Islam on what makes a government legitimate.
That tension, between divine and human authority, it's something that a lot of different cultures and religions have wrestled with.
It's a fundamental question, right? It gets to the heart of how we organize ourselves as societies.
Exactly. And like we said before, you see this diversity of thought within Islam as well.
Yeah.
Al-Farabi's idea of the virtuous ruler is one perspective. But most Sunni scholars, they emphasize this civil authority, meaning political power comes from the people.
That focus on consent is really important. It suggests that even in traditional Islamic thought, public participation was seen as valuable.
Absolutely.
But
And you see that reflected in the idea of Allahu wa al-Ag, those representatives who have a say in choosing the leader.
right, right. It challenges that stereotype that Islamic political thought is all about authoritarianism.
Yeah, it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
There's this strong tradition of consultation and consensus building that, honestly, I think a lot of modern political systems could learn from.
Especially with all the complex challenges we're facing today.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that this whole idea of ahal al-wala'ak has evolved over time. In modern Islamic thought, there's a growing emphasis on incorporating things like democratic principles and institutions.
So it's not just this fixed, unchanging concept.
Right. It can adapt to different systems.
It can evolve.
And that adaptability is one of the things that makes Islamic political thought so valuable.
Yeah.
It gives you this framework for dealing with governance while still holding on to those core values of justice and fairness.
But, like we've seen, there are definitely a range of interpretations within that framework. The source also talked about the Shesaya concept of imama.
Right, where leadership is divinely ordained. It passes down through the Prophet Muhammad's descendants.
That's a big difference from the Sunni view.
It is. It shapes how they understand political authority and how they think it should be exercised.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to politics in Islam.
Definitely not.
It's more like this rich tapestry of ideas and interpretations, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
It's a good reminder to be aware of that diversity, to approach these topics with nuance and an open mind.
Definitely. And speaking of nuance, we have to mention Ibn Khaldun. His approach to understanding political power was so ahead of its time.
Oh, absolutely. Focusing on social dynamics, the
Yeah.
cyclical nature of power, brilliant.
His concept of asabiyya, that social solidarity, is so fascinating.
It is.
It really highlights how important group cohesion is as a source of political power. And it explains how dynasties rise and fall based on whether that cohesion weakens or strengthens.
It's a framework that can help us make sense of history, but also of what's happening in the world today.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We see it all the time, like social movements gaining power as they build solidarity, regimes collapsing when they lose their base of support.
It's all connected. It shows you that political power is never static.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, always being shaped by these social forces.
Which means we need to understand those forces if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. One where power is shared fairly and used for the benefit of everyone, not just a select few.
Right. And that brings us back to those modern Muslim reformers, Afghani and Abdu.
Yeah.
They saw all the challenges of colonialism and modernity and called for this renewal of Islamic thought and action.
They were real trailblazers,
Hmm.
pushing for educational reform, engagement with science and technology, a more dynamic approach to Islamic law.
They believed Islam had the potential to offer solutions to the modern world's problems, but it needed to adapt to the times.
To keep up with the changing world.
Right. And their emphasis on reason, critical thinking, social justice, it's still inspiring reformers today.
It speaks to the enduring power of Islamic thought, its ability to adapt while staying true to its core values.
We've covered so much ground in this part of our deep dive. From Sufi cosmology to Islamic economics to all the complexities of political authority in Islam. It's amazing how all these topics connect and provide a really holistic view of how Islamic thought is engaging with the challenges we're facing today.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface, but I hope it's clear that there's so much depth and richness to these ideas.
Absolutely. Wow, we've really been through a lot in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
I mean, we started with, those warnings about environmental collapse and then the inspiring stuff from the Hizmet movement.
Right.
And then we explored like the depths of Sufi cosmology, rethinking how economics could work.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
It has, but now I'm thinking like, how do we actually put all this into practice?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, like how do we use these insights to actually build a better world, both, individually and as a society? What do you think?
Well, I think it starts with like looking inward, you know, examining our own choices,
Hmm.
seeing how we can make them line up with these principles we've been discussing.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking about it.
Exactly.
So what would that look like in everyday life?
Well, like Al-Khatiri, remember, he really pushed us to rethink our consumption habits.
Right.
It's about moving away from that excess,
Mm.
you know, trying to live more sustainably, being mindful of our impact, reducing waste, all that.
So making those daily choices, like buying eco-friendly products, maybe cutting back on driving, supporting businesses that are trying to do things ethically.
Exactly. Every little choice we make, every dollar we spend, it all adds up.
Just sends a message.
It does. It's like voting with your wallet, you know.
Mm.
When we support businesses that align with our values, we help shift things in the right direction.
Yeah, it all connects, doesn't it? Like with the Hizmet movement and their emphasis on social entrepreneurship, they're showing that you can do business and still make a positive impact.
Yeah, absolutely. They're proving that profit and purpose can actually go together.
Right. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
By bringing those social and environmental values into their business models, they're creating a more sustainable and resilient economy.
It's inspiring, seeing them take action, building businesses that help people and the planet.
It's a model for all of us, really.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, money either.
Right.
The Hizmet movement, they're also dedicated to dialogue and understanding between different faiths, which is so important.
Especially today.
It is. It's about bridging those divides, building relationships, and recognizing that we have more in common than not.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, we live in such a polarized world these days. But these sources, they remind us of our shared humanity.
Exactly.
That by finding common ground, we can actually work together to solve these big problems,
It all comes back to that idea of Tawhid, that oneness of God.
Oh, yeah.
If we believe that everything is connected, that we're all part of this divine tapestry, then treating each other with respect and compassion, well, it just becomes natural, doesn't it?
You're right, it does. Tawhid lays the foundation for a more just and equitable world because it's about recognizing the inherent worth of every single person.
Everyone deserves a chance to thrive. And that means making sure everyone has their basic needs met, food, shelter, healthcare.
It's more than just individual acts of charity, though, right?
It's got to be bigger than that. We need to address those systems that are creating the inequality, the injustice. We need to figure out how to distribute wealth and resources more fairly.
That's a tall order.
It is. But these sources give me hope because we're seeing people and organizations like the Hizmet movement, they're already doing this work.
They're showing us it's possible.
Yeah. They prove that change can happen and that even small acts of kindness and service can make a difference.
It's like a ripple effect,
It is. It all contributes to that larger goal of creating a better world.
So we all have a role to play, right?
We do.
Whether it's through our everyday choices or volunteering in our communities or speaking out against injustice, every little bit counts.
It does. As we finish up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Remember El Aswad talked about the whole cosmos glorifying God.
Yeah.
Where do we fit into that? How can we align our actions with that magnificent act of Casby?
That's such a beautiful question. It really makes you think about your place in the grand scheme of things. Like, what is our purpose? How can we live a life that honors that interconnectedness?
It's a journey we can all take, no matter what our beliefs are.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. And I hope it inspires you to keep exploring these ideas.
Keep the conversation going.
Right, and look for ways to put these principles into action. Make a difference in your own corner of the world.
Stay curious,
Yeah.
stay engaged, and stay hopeful.